time's up for me. Okay, I try to wrap up. Let me see. Oh, this is one book, and in one of these books, no, actually in both, there's one page that they said, I mean, the just war language, they said that actually it exists in ancient Greece, in Rome, and so on and so forth, and it's just only in the particular content that we find differences. So they admit, I mean, we are familiar, we are on the same page when we talk about just war, but we have slightly different understanding what it is. And then this one is a very bold assertion. It says that the Western just war theory has differences with both traditional Chinese and Marxist just war theories, but they have the same moral vision of morally restraining the proliferation of warfare and of promoting peace. This is one of the most astonishing statements I detect in reading these two books, and this is very, treasurable for them to say this. And so let me see. And then they say that, so we have some research on these used in battle, and then they said, we know them very well. We know these used in battle very well. However, they said that in spite of that, but this is not the only reasonable ethics, because ethics is conditioned by cultural values, and Chinese cultural values are different from and not inferior to Western ones. And so they would not, there's an unwillingness to adopt this as it is, and therefore there's some ambivalence about the just war language. And then let me skip this, and then skip this. And so that's the first factor to explain why they have been being ambivalent, because of the fact of culture. So if Western just war ethics is presented as an Enlightenment project, discerned by neutral reason, by Westerners, and by having binding on all nations, it would not be accepted by the PLA. And then that's the first factor, the factor of culture. And the factor of internal debate, I'll skip this, you can read this, and then there's a factor of international politics. And the PLA now is talking about soft power, so they are very willing to learn from the West on just war ethics. And then the factor of divergence, I'll skip all these. Actually, what I'm trying to say is there's a divergence in these 7 military ethics. And then the first treatise, the Masterson's Art of War, actually has the least just war elements. And unfortunately, it is the most popular treatise among the 7 in China as well as in USA. And I try to skip all these. However, there's one scholar who is willing to come forward and acknowledge there's a certain limitation of the Sun Tzu's Art of War in spite of its popularity, namely that there's no discrimination between just causes and unjust causes. So this is a very bold criticism, but you don't see in many other interpretations. So I'll skip all these and I'll skip all these. All right, let's go to looking ahead, the prospects. So in the future, there's bound to be different interpretations of the just war tradition in China, just like there's different interpretation of the just war, of the Western just war tradition as in this country. And then also, within China, there is a tug of war. The government will have a certain voice, and then the civil society will have another voice. I mean, the future development will depend on how such a tug of war will go. And then how about those, say, outside China? What can they do? There are many things that they could do that will encourage a more healthy development, like, do more research on these other 6 military classics rather than just on Sun Tzu, and try to refute the wrongness of Johnston and so on and so forth. And then try to have more dialogue and mutual visits. And whenever you visit, donate as many works on just war to them as possible. Actually, they have, in one of the books, they have a list of this. They say that we know there are some recent books on just war published in English, and they have a list of those. But it's a very small list. So if you donate more to them, they will know more. And they say they were trying to translate more of them into Chinese. And then this is a multicultural world. And then, so I would say that if possible, if in the future, that someone can compile an anthology of just war ethics, a multicultural approach, that consists of primary readings, not just interpretations. And in that case, there would be, and then it would be nice. And then China has done her part in trying to understand Western just war ethics, as I try to show you in these volumes. And so if China would feel respected if there are attempts of reverse understanding and appreciation. And such attempts will be reported back to China. And only on such a basis of equal respect can the PLA and the Chinese people be bold enough to assimilate into their warfare ethics small components of Western just war ethics, cross-cultural overlapping consensus on warfare ethics, rather than Western ethics. Thank you.
All right, as advertised, BC, thank you. Our final speaker on this panel is Dr. Valerie Morkevicius. She is a 2010-2011 resident fellow at the Stockdale Center here. For the past 2 years, she was a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at DePaul in Chicago, obviously. She previously had taught 2 years at St. Xavier University, also in Chicago. She completed her BA in French and East Asian languages and literatures at Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She then headed to the University of Chicago, much like Ed Barrett. She did an MA in the Committee on International Relations in 2000 and a PhD in Political Science in 2008. Her dissertation was entitled Unholy Alliance, the Just War Traditions as Power Politics, and it explores the realist underpinnings of Christian, Islamic, and Hindu just war thinking. And again, like Ed, she had Professor Elstein not just on her committee, but as the chair of her committee. Let me just read you a few of her recent publications, a breathtaking list. The Prism of Just War, Asian and Western Perspectives on the Legitimate Use of Military Force. A piece on the Protestant just war thought in World Religions and Norms of War. An essay, Just War, An Ethic of Restraint or the Defense of Order, was published in Justice and Violence, Political Violence, Pacifism, and Cultural Transformation. This year, she will publish a critique of the just war thought from the Protestant just peace perspective in a book edited by Greg Reichberg and Matt Levering, whom many of you know. She'll also have a sourcebook chapter on the norms of war in Protestant Christianity, again in an edited volume published by Cambridge. It's forthcoming. And she's working on, as though she weren't already busy enough, turning her dissertation into a book, and she'll have a journal submission, Power and Order, the Shared Logics of Realism and Just War Theory. So, Valerie, we're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, although I owe a huge amount of debt to Professor Elstein, I should relieve her of responsibility for my dissertation. She was on the committee, but my chair was Bob Pape. So,
I apologize. Thank you.
Hence the realist influence on my thought. That caveat aside, I have 3 more thanks and caveat points. So one is thank you to the class of 1962, who is sitting in the back row. They paid for my fellowship this year, so I had to thank them. And then a list of caveats. Unlike the canonical tradition apparently in China before 1911, and unlike in Islam and in Western Christianity, Hinduism is not a textual religion, and there's not a canon of just war theory. So entering into this sort of project is something you do with a lot of trepidation and nervousness, because you're making claims that expand over about 5,000 years of history and that end before the Mughal invasion, right? So you're looking at a period of time that ends before the modern era, and then from that you're trying to imagine what modern implications would be. So that's the dangerous waters into which I'm walking. So nonetheless, right, as an ancient religious tradition, Hinduism has a great deal to say about the ethics of war. Holy scriptures, poetry, advice to kings, and ancient legal codes can all provide insight into the Hindu idea of just war. But India's absorption into the Mughal Empire and later the British Empire meant that for centuries, Hindu insights into the ethics of war and conflict were subsumed by Islamic and Christian ones. Modern India emerged from the colonial era as a resolutely secular democracy, further restricting the possibility of an active Hindu discourse on the norms of war. Realistically, this means that as far as I know, there are 4 or 5 academics who are doing work on this in the United States and in India. And in terms of public discourse in India, there's almost nothing on the part of the major political parties for a variety of political reasons. These historical realities in turn shape my talk today. The first half focuses on the, actually more first two-thirds, focus on the ethics of war as derived from Hinduism's ancient texts. This requires entering into not only a different religious and cultural world, but into a different historical milieu, where the capabilities and limitations of fighting forces were quite different than they are today. And in my text, I've sort of organized my talk today around categories of just war thought, ad bellum and in bello, although those don't actually exist in those terms in the tradition. And I've organized it in that way because I think it will be clearer to communicate the points to you that way. And so I'm eschewing a historical perspective, which would show that these ideas actually morph and change over time, among other possible ways I could have organized my points. The second half of my talk will attempt to suggest some ways in which the traditional understandings might be applicable in the modern world. So let's begin by talking about the textual tradition. The first caveat I've already mentioned, it's not a textual religion, so take it with a grain of salt, right? The texts exist, some people know them, religious scholars know them. The stories of the greatest treatises, the Mahabharata, for example, or the Ramayana, are both pop culture and sacred religious texts. So people might be quite familiar with the stories. But nonetheless, it's not the same sort of religion where an everyday believer would go to one of these texts to try to find an answer to a problem, right? Instead, it's a lived experience, which is rather different. Second, the texts cover a huge expanse of time, which is divided into roughly two halves. There's the Vedic age, which is from roughly 1500 to 500 BC, and the post-Vedic age. And if I was going to give it in a historical format, I would point out that the rules of war in these two contexts are quite different. The Vedic age is less restrictive in both cause and conduct, whereas the post-Vedic age is more restrictive. My dissertation can talk about why, but I won't here. Okay, so let's proceed in three parts to take a look at the ethics of war based on these texts. First, we'll explore the role of the use of force in the world, touching on themes of legitimate authority and just cause. Second, we'll delve into the in bello rules of war. And lastly, we'll consider some of the alternatives to war that exist within the tradition. So let's begin with the ad bellum perspective. In Hinduism, force is seen as a natural part of life, a tool used by the virtuous to protect the innocent, and not only as a tool used by the strong to oppress the weak. These dueling types of force used for order, force used for good, versus force used for chaos and force used for evil, can be witnessed throughout the natural world, and human societies are no exception. For example, the Code of Manu expresses the idea by saying, if the king did not tirelessly inflict punishment on those who would be punished, the stronger would roast the weaker like fish on a spit. The crow would eat the sacrificial cake. There would be no ownership in everyone, and everything would be upside down. The whole world is mastered by punishment. The idea here is that force is not actually something which is bad or dangerous or needs to be restricted. Force is merely something which has to be used in the right ways. And in used in the right ways, it prevents all sorts of bad things that we don't like chaos, disorder, and social unrest. Consequently, the use of force is not itself inherently either good or bad. It's simply something that is. Its normative value comes from the outcomes it produces, from its ends. This makes the Hindu approach quite different from pacifist perspectives, which see the use of force as inherently problematic, and from the Judeo-Christian and Islamic approaches to just war, which are much more interested in the motivations, intentions, and causes that drive the use of force than Hinduism is. This being said, when force is used to maintain order and uphold justice, and my timer won't stay awake, force is not only necessary, but a positive good. If rulers did not use force to restrain and punish wrongdoers, evil would triumph and the innocent would suffer. One famous passage from the Mahabharata is the chapter which is the Bhagavad Gita. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, he's a prince, and he's about to fight a war, which happens to be a civil war against his cousins, who have treated him and his brothers terribly badly, have stolen the throne, and really they've reached last resort. And if you've been reading along in the whole Mahabharata up till this point, you can't understand why on earth Arjuna hasn't already gotten it done with and fought this battle, because the other side is really evil, and they've had it out for him for a long time. But Arjuna, on the eve of the battle, is overlooking the battlefield, and he sees all of his